Hello and welcome to this New South Wales Farmers and Young Farmer Business Program recording of the Gearing Up for Good Governance program. So we ran a series of workshops across New South Wales in the beginning of 2021, looking at grant writing and good governance. And part of that package was to also be able to provide some of this information in an online format so that you can watch this at a later stage. My name's Julia Spicer. My business is Engage and Create Consulting, and I'm based in Goondiwindi in southern Queensland. And it was my absolute pleasure to work with both the New South Wales Farmers, Young Farmers and the Young Farmer Business Program to deliver this work. My contact details are at the end of this Zoom. Hopefully you'll survive the Zoom program to be able to find them if you need to be able to have a talk about things that might be happening to a particular group or committee that you're part of. But this is really a 101 overview of what good governance is, what it looks like, and why it is really incredibly important for our community groups. I'm a really firm believer of the regions have the solutions to all of the problems that we see, but sometimes what we need to be able to do is look at how we can really work well together to get the best out of each other in this space. So I want to start with talking about, well, what is corporate governance? What is it that we are looking at, and what is it that this definition means? Some people watching this might have heard about the Australian Institute of Company Directors. I highly recommend, if you have the opportunity to do a course such as that, that you do it. They often will have scholarships for regional people, but that certainly will give you the everything of governance. But I would recommend that you've been involved with a few groups and boards prior to taking on the company directors, so you've got some really good experience already you can incorporate. Okay, so what is corporate governance? We've got some areas here that reflect what our governance is. It's really the strategic planning of the business or the organisation, whether we are talking about the local tennis club, all the way through to a grains panel or a cotton growers association or some other network that you might be part of. So it really is about supporting the strategic part of the business, as well as looking at, well, operationally, how are we achieving things? And I'm really conscious some people on the call or some people on the Zoom will have staff that they might employ. If you work for a Landcare, if you're part of a Landcare network, you might have some project officers who you employ, or not, you're a group of volunteers and you don't have staff. You still need to be thinking about, when are we working on the strategic part of the business or the community group? And when do we need to talk about the nuts and bolts? And how do we separate those conversations so that we're really clear when we're talking strategy and when we're talking operations? When we sit around a board, are absolutely responsible for risk management and compliance, looking at how effective we are as a business. Are we legal? Have we got all of the insurances that we need? What are the risks? What's on the horizon, as well as internally? So again, if we're part of a board that employs staff, they're our greatest asset. They're also our greatest risk. Our main job is keeping them alive and safe. And so we'll spend a lot of time looking at, well, what's the risk management and the compliance piece that we need to think about. And as board members, we're responsible for that. We're absolutely responsible for financial management. So are we solvent is a question that needs to be asked regularly. Do we understand our financials? Do we know where our money's going? Do we know when it's coming in? So are we aware of cash flow? And equally in this day and age, also our external reporting. So we've got funding from a state or federal government department. We've got a grant funded through FRRR perhaps. We've applied for a community gambling fund or some sort of community-based project. We need to be able to show that we can deliver and equip these projects, and we've got the appropriate reporting. And we're also really responsible, and this should really be the first point, around succession planning and culture. There is a fantastic book called A Fish Rots from the Head, and we as board members are responsible for the culture, the values, and how they are rolled out throughout our organisation, regardless of the scale. So it is equally important for a Westpac Bank or a BHP to have strong culture and succession planning as it is for our local show society or camp draft group. We need to be really clear around what is the succession planning. Nobody wants to come to an AGM and be given the dreaded plastic box as the secretary to know that you may never be able to pass that on. What we don't want is people not taking on roles because they think they're never going to be able to exit that. And that's a really common thing that we see often. So let's have a look at what then, if they're the areas of corporate governance, what's the role then for our board? So when we think about it from a strategic direction perspective, we are 100% responsible for what are the policies, what are the goals, what's the strategies, where's our organisation going, where will it be in 5 years, what do we want it to look like, what are the programs that we're wanting to be able to support, how are we making a difference in our community. They're the conversations at a strategic level we need to be having all of the time. Often people think strategic planning is a fairly painful process, and it could be if you haven't done it very often. What we want to avoid is having some beautiful document that sits on a shelf somewhere, never to be touched again. These need to be regular conversations that we're having. Where on your agendas at meetings do you have strategy conversations? How often do you allow for those conversations to happen in amongst all of the operational activities that are going on? As I said, we're responsible for the resources, both financial and also equipment, assets, all of the rest of it, but equally our personnel. So our people, how we hire and fire, what's our workforce planning? Are we employing people or do we call in contractors? What does all of that look like? 100% we're responsible for that. Our performance. So this is a big piece of our evaluation. How have we gone against the strategies or the goals that we set up? Which is partly why sometimes people don't enjoy planning, because we plan, stick it on a shelf and then forget to have a look at it. So if we said we wanted to increase profit, or if we said we wanted to have 2 more part-time staff by the end of the year, how are we going with that? We don't want to just have these conversations and then never come back to them. We're expecting some KPIs for our staff potentially. We also want to think about what are the KPIs or key performance indicators of the board. The role of the board is around compliance, having these legal and accounting requirements. We often, the bigger the board, the more we might have some subcommittees that also take this on. There might be a risk and finance or a finance and audit committee that sits under the overarching board that really focuses on this. But we want to be really clear that it's all of our responsibility legally to do good due diligence and be aware of everything that's happening. Risk is a really interesting one. Sitting around a board, we will have board members that have got different risk appetites. Some people are really risk averse, whereas others welcome risk more and are less worried about it. And so being able to really understand what is the risk appetite around the table and what are we doing? Are we making sure that all of our board members feel that they've had enough time and opportunity to make decisions on what we're doing? What's the processes that we use to make decisions, and what does that risk framework look like? So often we'll have a risk matrix document that we might have to do for a project proposal. It's also good to make sure that your board is also having a look at risks. So some of those exercises or things you could look at is, doing a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths and weaknesses of our board and organisation? If we were to hold a mirror to the board and the committee as it stands, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses? So that very much internal we have control over. And then when we think about opportunities and threats, you really need to think about what's coming over the horizon at you. So obviously COVID in recent times has been a threat. There's also been some opportunities for businesses that have come out of it. Drought and climate change, obviously, both a threat to a lot of us. Also, where is there opportunity for that to result in change or change of business? So thinking about opportunities and threats are very much things we don't have control over that are coming at us from a distance. And this piece around accountability to shareholders and members. So again, if we're a Westpac or a BHP or somebody like that, we've got some accountability to shareholders that's going on, but equally for our members. If we are New South Wales farmers, we are accountable to the members who are paying us money and having voting rights for different things that we're doing. So we need to be able to report that progress back to people. Here's our strategies and goals for the next 12 months. And then every few months, here's how we're going towards them. We are absolutely responsible for getting the message back out to people around what's going on. Now, a couple of people might be thinking, well, hold on a second, you know, we pay some staff money, you know, some of this is their role to be doing, and that's fair for those that have got staff that they employ in their community group or their organisation. What we want to think about is where there's difference between leadership and management. And if we look at it, leadership really is about the people. It's that forward moving. We're looking at, you know, what's coming on the horizon and have we got everything in place to be able to deal with that. So we are setting the framework, and that is the leadership and governance piece. The management is then who's coming along behind us to do this work. Here's the delegation, or here's the program that we want delivered. Now the expectation is that you can go and do the implementation phase. So it's really around that, getting something done, task oriented. We've got this much funding that's come in to deliver these sorts of projects, and we've got a staff or team that can do that. Different groups will have different delegation documents. So some might have, you know, if I was your project officer, up to $500 I can buy or put on a credit card to be able to make sure that the project I'm working on for you is well delivered. Anything over that needs to come to a committee meeting or something like that. So think about what are those delegation documents. And the other part where there's delegation is often in management of staff. So the board will delegate to the CEO or the general manager to ensure that all of the HR is happening, that staff are all managed. So the HR component is delegated by the board to the general manager or CEO to then manage any other staff that might be part of it. So that's really where that line comes. And often what ends up being a little murky for some groups is when we have boards that are forgetting that their role is not the operational day-to-day running of staff, and that somebody is actually employed for that. Happy to talk to groups individually around that if that's something that you're concerned about. So one of the big areas that I wanted to focus on in this recording is I guess the main thing that we do when we are working together as a board, and that is in meetings. We all have positive experiences of meetings, and I'd encourage you to think about, well, what made that meeting positive or productive? What was it about the structure of that meeting, the agenda, the way that the chair ran the meeting? What was it that made it a positive experience? And I'm almost certain I'm not the only one that has had to sit through some fairly painful meetings as well. So let's think about what made that a more negative experience. What was frustrating about it? What didn't work? And the reason we want to spend some time thinking about this is because obviously we want to check in on ourselves. What are the meetings that we are part of that are not as productive, and what's our role in fixing them? One of the things we need to be really clear of is that we are all responsible as board members around the table. We are all responsible for the success of that organisation. So if we have a chair that is struggling, might be a weaker chair with some of the personalities that might be sitting around, we are, as board members, equally responsible for the success of that meeting, which means in some circumstances you might need to play more of a role in bringing this meeting back on track, in reminding people that there's an agenda, in reminding people that we've got half an hour left until our meeting's finished, whatever that looks like. So I'd encourage you to have a think about that. So when we think about preparing for meetings, one of the things that can sometimes happen is we forgot why we have this meeting. We've been meeting on the, you know, we're a 70-year-old organisation and we've just always met on the second Tuesday of every month. Great. Do we still need to do that? Is that still serving a purpose? Are we getting outcomes from that? Constitutionally, we might need to do something. There might be something in our constitution that says how often we meet. Again, if that's working, great. If it's not serving a purpose, or by default you've done different things, and this life of COVID is a great example where potentially your face-to-face meetings have become Zoom or otherwise, I just would really encourage you to think about, is one of the ways that we can improve the effectiveness of our committee is to actually look at what meetings we're having and are they still serving us, and what might we need to do to change some of what's going on. So I want to talk about the preparation piece of a meeting. So we need to first of all think about what's the information that needs to be received prior to the meeting. Now, this might seem fairly straightforward, but in a minute, I'll talk about some of the responsibilities that you have legally as you sign up to be a board member or committee member on any not-for-profit or any incorporated association. There's some things that you sign up to, and it's really important that you're aware of those. So we need to know the agenda and what the previous meeting minutes are. I have a bit of a rule: if there's no agenda, I'm not coming, because no agenda means that there's no plan or process, which means that we're just having a chat. And if we're having a chat, I'd rather go to the pub than sit in a meeting. So for me, there needs to be an agenda, and I also need to see those meeting minutes previously, because that's work that we need to be able to have a look at beforehand. We need to make sure that meetings are for ideas and decision making, not for information download. So lots of us will have sat in a meeting where the CEO or the coordinator or somebody spends 45 minutes talking through a report that could have been emailed to us beforehand so that we can have a read of it, and then use that 45 minutes for discussions, questions, checking in. What are we doing as a result of it? What decisions need to be made from here? So we need to be really careful that we haven't fallen into habits where our meetings are information download, not about discussion and decision making. So anything that is information that you want discussed at a meeting, I would be suggesting get that sent to you prior. So we often think about it in terms of financials. That's absolutely something. If we're looking at project reports, if we're looking at strategic planning, they're all the sorts of documents that we can get beforehand. Now, some people will read them diligently. That's sometimes not me, but it's my responsibility to come to that meeting prepared to make decisions on what needs to happen, as it is everybody else's. But we need to, for us to be able to do that, we need to get that information early. So lots of committees and boards will have a calendar that says we meet on the second Tuesday of the month, but on the last Tuesday of the month is when all of the information gets sent to us, so that we've got a week or two to read it before the meeting. I mentioned before about some requirements that you've got. You're responsible to do due diligence on any activities or decisions that are being made at the board, and that's under the Corporations Act. So anytime we sign up to a board or committee, we are responsible for the decisions that are made. Me saying, well, look, I ran out of time to read the notes, so I just agreed with what everybody said, is not a defendable option if something goes wrong. So legally, we are required to do the work. You might start at some stage thinking about, I sit on a group and there's a few people that come and bring a heartbeat, and that's about it. So part of the conversations that we have when we're in a room, and this isn't a recorded session, is, do we need to think about who is sitting around the table for our committee? Are we better off having fewer people who are dedicated than begging people to come along, but they're not contributing, and they're certainly not doing any of their work in between meetings? So I kind of leave that with you as food for thought, because the reality is those people may not be the most valuable asset that you've got around the table. I said about the importance of an agenda, and it's really, really critical. This is a really important part. The agenda is the engine of the meeting. It's a list of things that we want to get done. It's where the discussions are going to go. It's where we're putting our time and energy to progress this organisation that we volunteer for, predominantly, that we volunteer for, to move it towards this beacon on the hill, this point of the horizon that we're wanting to get it to. So if we don't have an agenda, we don't have focus, and it's hard to get any progress from that position. We know that any conversation has an architecture. What's the focusing question? What's the background, the ideas and the decisions that need to be made? So the focusing question in the background is stuff that hopefully we can receive prior to the meeting. And then it's the ideas and the decision part of that conversation that can really come up through the course of the agenda item. We want to think about how we develop and distribute the agendas. So from a governance perspective, you know, it's often the chair and the secretary, or where we have employed people, the CEO or manager, who are responsible for what's on the agenda and getting it out there. I really encourage you to think about putting times allocated to different agenda items so that, again, we are putting the right energy on the right topics. We want to prioritise our discussion items. We don't want to leave the most important topic to the last agenda item, because if we've gone over on time or people are tired or whatever's happening, we potentially don't have a chance to have that conversation. And really, you want to work on developing a template and sticking to it. People like consistency. They like to know where they stand. We can get that prior to the meeting, either email. Some committees these days have got a Dropbox folder or a OneDrive or somewhere, again, where it's centralised and everybody can access that information. Having some of this information in a more central place is also really important from a succession planning point of view. And then we think about, during the meeting, what do we need to think about? The physical arrangement of the room, the tables and the chairs. It's much easier to have a conversation with people when we can all see each other's face. It's very hard to have conversations when some people at the back of the room can only see the backs of heads moving forward. Also, I know I'm talking to an agricultural crowd. Some of us are better in one ear than we are another for whatever reason. So we also want to make sure that people are sitting in the room where they can hear what is going on. I feel like I've mentioned agenda a couple of times, but you can get the feeling that's an important one for me. We want to make sure that there's engagement. Again, having a heartbeat and sitting around the table is actually not enough. If you come to meetings as a committee person and you leave and you've not said anything, you're responsible for that, as is everybody else. So we need to be able to say, the chair needs to be able to say, Mary, I haven't heard anything from you on this point. I'm going to go and ask a few more people and come back and get your views on this. We need to make sure that everybody is having their say as part of this. And we need to really make sure that we're respecting the energy and the time that people are investing. And I'll talk a little bit about that again in a minute. The follow-up is really important. What are the actions that are coming out of the meetings? That's certainly something from a minutes perspective that are important. But if you say you're going to do something at a meeting, you need to do it. Again, we all have enough other things that we could be doing in our lives that if we're not actually making achievements and there's not movement on some of the conversations that we're having, we may as well go to the pub. So if there's not follow-up from your meetings, then you're missing a really key opportunity to engage and use the strength and intelligence of the people around the table. We need to start and finish on time. There'll be some people who only ever get there at 7:15, even though the meeting starts at 7, but the meeting's never started at 7, so why would they get there then? So think about the habits that are being created and given off. So if all of a sudden we start having a meeting at 7 o'clock, people will start arriving and making sure that they're there for it. Equally, if we said we're going to finish by 8:30, guess what? I'm out of there at 8:30. People will have planned things around, their life will have been planned around the assumption that that meeting's starting and finishing on time, and you need to respect that. As I said, we need to think about how we can allocate some time for strategy discussions at every board meeting, making sure that people are coming not just to think about, what colour armbands do we need at the next event and what's the beer that we're going to be selling, but equally, what are our targets for fundraising this year? If we meet those targets, what are we going to be doing with those dollars? Where do we want this event to be in 5 years' time? How do we make sure this event isn't impacted if COVID, flood, locust plague, whatever else comes along? They're the strategic conversations that you might want to be having. And at any time, the board needs to be able to review how they are functioning together. So yes, you also need to be doing staff reviews and performance reviews for any employees that you might have, but equally we need to be also ensuring that boards and committees are doing self-evaluation. And the 3 easiest questions, Dr. Ian Plowman, who's done a lot of work across Australia, talks about there being 3 main questions that we need to ask from an evaluation point of view. What's working? What isn't? What could we do differently? At the end of each meeting, that's a really good question to ask, particularly if you're starting to review your meeting processes and you're wanting to tighten up some of your good governance. What worked in this meeting? What didn't? What should we do differently for next meeting? Will be one of those things that you can start to look at. Because during these meetings, You've got some ethical and legal requirements. You have a constitution of the organisation that you need to ensure that you are looking at. We could spend a lot of time talking about constitutions, but basically a good constitution won't get in the way of you doing things. You do need to know where it is. When you do find it, it's often at the bottom of a plastic box that a secretary was given many moons ago. Scan it and whack it into that Dropbox folder we spoke about earlier so everybody can find it. You'll also often need to attach that to a grant application if anybody's applying for those. But you'll have some legal requirements out of your constitution. How do people become members? How long can they stay in an executive role? If you don't have a time limit on some of your executive roles, that might be something to have a think about. So that again, from a succession planning and culture perspective, people know that they're happy to take on a president role if they're not thinking that they're going to die in that role. So think about some of those bits and pieces. But you do have a constitution that guides you. You might also have a code of conduct or some values of the organisation. That also is something that you use to look at who becomes staff in your organisation. Equally, who becomes members in your organisation, but that might be another document that helps guide you. And also you'll have a myriad of policies and procedures, and that's helping you with this framework around, are we conducting these meetings well? Have we got diversity around the table? Are we considering all of our work health and safety requirements for staff and volunteers in our organisation? Think about the decisions that you're making and the ways in which we make decisions. So often, it can be majority wins as a consensus, who's in favour of this, who's not, thinking kind of thing. What we do want to avoid is this comment around groupthink. So that's basically where we all just start to not have any diversity in our ideas. Everybody just agrees with everybody all of the time. And I'd suggest from a governance perspective, that becomes a risk. If we're all thinking the same things, then we're bound to miss something. So think about, again, that comes from a mixture of diversity of people around the board, ages, backgrounds, cultures, experience, etc., etc. Because what we want to do is avoid this thing where we all think exactly the same. For you as an individual board member, if ever there are decisions made that you do not feel comfortable about, you need to say something. It needs to be documented in the minutes. You need to be able to ask the question, I'm uneasy about this much money being spent on this new piece of equipment because I think that's going to impact our cash flow. I would like it noted in the minutes that I think this needs to happen down the track, or I think we need to get more quotes, or I think we need to whatever. If something does not feel right, you need to be able to articulate that, because again, in the worst case scenario, if anything did happen, that's the kind of information that people go back and have a look at in terms of, who was responsible for some of these decisions. So think about it. If I don't ask this question, will I regret it? Will I get home at the end of the night and be like, God, I wish I really, stepped up and asked that question, or I really wish I approached the chair about this thing before our meeting started, whatever it might be. So we want to be able to be really clear that we avoid the meeting after the meeting. I don't know about all of you, but I seem to sit through a meeting in a hall somewhere and then spend equally the same amount of time in a car park outside when we discuss all of the things that really should have made it to the meeting inside. So we want to be able to all build some skills and some capacity around doing that. And again, we want to follow up after our meetings. What worked? What didn't? Is what we're doing moving the organisation forward in line with the strategic plan and the values? Are we making progress on what we said we would do to get this organisation, this committee, whatever we are, closer to that end point? It is really important that that becomes one of those conversations that we have. After the meeting, we need to make sure that the minutes are distributed. We need to make sure that this action list, this follow-up, so people know what it is that is expected of them between this meeting and the next, making sure that all of that's documented. We want to give them the confirmation for the next meeting. We want to let them know we've got a guest speaker coming or whatever it might be. We might need to follow up some information based on some of the discussions that were had. It might be that we weren't able to make a decision at the meeting because some of the information was missing, and we've said that we would follow that up before the next meeting. So we need to think about some of that. And if there are any concerns that you have about what's going on, it is really appropriate to talk to the chair or president about it. If the chair or president is what you've got concerns about, you've got other people around the executive. There's a vice chair or vice president. There might be the treasurer or the secretary. There'll be somebody else who can have that conversation. At the end of the day, for the majority of us, we live in little communities. We don't necessarily need to like everybody that's sitting around the table with us, but we do need to be able to work well with them. We do need to be able to effectively engage and move these organisations forward. And so being really clear around the people and the behaviour side of things is really important. Certainly something that we look at when we do these workshops face-to-face. But I'd encourage you to have a look at the Australian Institute of Company Directors website, the ourcommunity.org website, and certainly New South Wales Farmers website for any more information around how to ensure our people are doing good things when it comes to some of this governance work. I do really like this piece around, culture is king or queen if we're being politically correct. And this saying around we can't talk our way out of a situation we've behaved ourselves into. So I think that's one of those things. I've mentioned already the Fish Rots from the Head book, and that is a really good one. We want to be really clear how often when any new person joins the committee or staff or membership base, we don't say, oh, what we do here is, or we've always done this way, or no, your idea is no good, we tried that in the 80s and we've never gone back to it. We need to be really clear around how engaging and inviting we are to new people. Every group I talk to across Australia wants more members or more people involved, more people engaged. We need to be careful that we are actually not detracting from that, or we're not part of the reason why people aren't coming. We need to really think about our values, the code of conduct, the behaviour that we are prepared to have sitting around our board table, and potentially there's some work that you need to do there. And from, again, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, when their definition of acting in good faith, which is what we do when we take on being a board member, is that we're going to act honestly, with integrity and for a proper purpose, for the purpose of that organisation. I've chatted lots about lots of different things. I just want to bring this to a bit of a summary for you. This page is really useful for a couple of different reasons. It really summarises a lot of what I've talked about in the last half an hour or so, and it also gives you some ideas of where you might want to do some work. So copy and paste this list, what you could, or print this page, or take a photo, whatever the young kids are doing these days. But what you want is this list of characteristics, because there's a couple of things you can do with it. Take it to your next board meeting, or talk to your chair about it, or whoever it might be, and ask if this is part of a strategic conversation that you would like to have at your next board meeting. And what you do is, with the board around these topics, we simply rate ourselves. We might do out of 5, we might do out of 10. So out of 5, how are we in terms of our clear communication? 0's terrible, 5's we're killing it. What would we put? What's the number that we put beside clear communication? We'll give it a 3. Relating to management. So how do we go engaging with our staff and knowing what's going on, or with our manager? 4, that's no dramas. We don't have any issues there. Board is action oriented. No, actually, we come and we have a great chat and we all catch up, but we're not really action focused. We're going to give ourselves a 1 for that. You can see what I mean. Moving through the list, rank yourselves. And then if you've done it out of 5, my suggestion would be, what you want to do is focus on anything that got a 1, 2, or 3 and deal with those first. So let's pick a couple of things and make change there, rather than say we're going to overhaul the whole thing. Pick anything that was a low ranking and look at how you want to improve that. Equally, if there's things that are 4 or 5, how do we make sure we hold on to that? What is it about board members listening to each other really well that means that we gave that a 4? How do we make sure we don't lose that ability when committees change and we might not be sitting around the table in the new world? So this can be a really useful exercise. The other way to look at it, if you don't want to do the numbers, is to do it with the traffic lights. So green is good, orange is, we've got to keep an eye on it, red is warning, not so great. So you can do traffic lights or numerical, whichever you want to do, but this can be really useful. The other thing that I wanted to leave you with was some good questions that you can ask. So you might want to, again, take this page with you to one of your meetings and just ask some of these questions. You know, how do we find the meetings are being run? Are there any suggestions that people might have around the table as to how we could make our meetings really efficient and effective, and at the same time make sure that we all feel comfortable with the decisions that are being made? How are we reporting to our members? Is there something that at different times board members or committee can do to go and touch base with members around the region and see what's going on there? Do we need a couple of working groups or subcommittees under the broader board to really push through some of these projects or ideas that we've been having? So again, some good questions here to consider for your group. And then think about, well, where are you at? What are the actions that you and your committee are working on at the moment? Do you have a strategic plan or an operational manual? Where are you at with some of the other plans that might sit in under this work? What are the policies that you want? What's the governance calendar? You know, is it really clear to everybody when things are happening and when there's expectations of them to have reports, have project summaries, whatever it might be, to the broader committee. So thinking about, you know, how are you travelling as a committee at the moment, and what are some of those little tweaks that you could do to be able to progress the organisation and have you working really clearly towards the vision and the strategies that you've got in place for your committee. I hope that this has been really useful. As I said, we've touched on a whole lot of different topics in this process, and it is the concept being that we can give you an overarching view on a whole lot of pieces to think about from a governance perspective, and you've got opportunities to be able to follow up. So New South Wales Farmers has a whole range of resources that that you can have access to, including the PDF of this presentation. If you would like to make contact with me to talk through any specifics, there's some contact details there for me. But I really hope that what we can do is take the sentiment of corporate governance being a bit painful or a bit dodgy away, and make sure that we can see that having good governance for our community groups, whether we employ staff or not, regardless of the size that we are, regardless of whether we're paid or volunteer board members, what we can do is to really just tweak some things around the edges so that we have the opportunity to progress our organisations and our associations forward, because that is really what we know we need from a regional perspective. Thanks so much for listening along, and I look forward to making contact with you soon.